On May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska, a child named Malcolm Little was born into a world already hostile to his existence. From the very beginning, Malcolm Little's life was surrounded by danger, fear, and racial hatred that would shape everything to come. His father, Earl Little, was not just any man. Earl Little was a Baptist minister and a vocal supporter of Marcus Garvey, the black nationalist leader who preached black pride, economic independence, and resistance to white oppression. Because of these beliefs, Earl Little became a target. Omaha in the 1920s was not a safe place for outspoken black activists. White supremacist groups, including members associated with the Ku Klux Klan and the Black Legion, operated openly. Malcolm Little's family lived under constant threat. Before Malcolm Little was even born, white supremacists reportedly confronted Earl Little, demanding he stop spreading Garvey's message. The danger was clear long before the violence escalated. When Malcolm Little was still a child, the family fled Omaha and moved to Milwaukee and later to Lansing, Michigan, hoping for safety. But racism followed them. In Lansing, the Littles' home was burned to the ground. The fire was officially ruled an accident, but neighbors and later Malcolm himself believed it was arson, a warning meant to silence Earl Little. This was not an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern. Earl Little refused to back down. Then in 1931, tragedy struck again. Earl Little was found dead near a streetcar track in Lansing. His body was badly mutilated. Authorities ruled his death an accident, claiming he was hit by a streetcar. But the circumstances raised serious doubts. Earl Little had received death threats. He had enemies. His skull was crushed. His body appeared deliberately placed. Malcolm Little would later state plainly that he believed his father was murdered by white supremacists, likely connected to the Black Legion, a white racist group active in the Midwest at the time. Despite this, insurance companies refused to pay out the full life insurance benefits, claiming suicide. With Earl Little gone, the family collapsed into extreme poverty. Malcolm Little's mother, Louise Little, was left to raise 8 children alone. Louise was strong, intelligent, and disciplined, but the pressure was unbearable. Welfare workers constantly monitored the family, often interfering and humiliating them. Food was scarce. Stability disappeared. As the years passed, the strain broke her. In 1939, Louise Little was diagnosed with mental illness and committed to Kalamazoo State Hospital, where she remained for more than 2 decades. Malcolm Little was only a teenager. With both parents gone, one dead under suspicious circumstances, the other institutionalized, the little children were split apart and sent to foster homes and state institutions. The family was destroyed. This moment would become one of the deepest scars of Malcolm Little's life. Yet even in chaos, something remarkable emerged. At school, Malcolm Little was brilliant. He read constantly, he spoke clearly, he excelled academically. Teachers recognized his intelligence and classmates noticed his sharp mind. For a time, school became his refuge. Malcolm Little dreamed of becoming a lawyer. But the system had other plans. One day, after Malcolm Little shared his ambition, a white teacher told him bluntly that becoming a lawyer was no realistic goal for a Negro. The teacher suggested Malcolm consider a trade instead, something practical for someone like him. That moment mattered. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't violent, it was quiet, dismissive, and final. For Malcolm Little, it confirmed what life had already been teaching him. Intelligence was not enough. Hard work was not enough. Talent did not matter when the rules were designed to exclude you. His motivation collapsed. Malcolm Little began withdrawing from school. His grades fell. His belief in the future disappeared. By the early 1940s, still a teenager, Malcolm Little left Michigan and moved to Boston, where his older half-sister Ella Little Collins lived. It was the first step into a new world, one far removed from classrooms and childhood dreams. What followed would be a descent into crime, survival, and the streets, a transformation that would later shock the world when Malcolm Little emerged again under a new name. But at this point in the story, there was no Malcolm X. There was only a young black boy shaped by racism, violence, betrayal, and loss, a boy whose life had already been marked by forces far bigger than him. Did you know Malcolm X was a top student before life changed? Comment, Malcolm Real, if this surprised you. By 1943, the boy once known as a top student was gone. Malcolm Little was now a teenager moving between worlds: no parents, no stable home, no clear future. When he arrived in Boston, he stayed with his older half-sister, Ella Little Collins, in the predominantly black neighborhood of Roxbury. Ella cared deeply for him and tried to guide him, but the streets were already calling. Boston exposed Malcolm Little to a different reality, one filled with music, nightlife, hustling, and survival. He took jobs as a shoeshine boy, waiter, and busboy, working in places where jazz musicians, hustlers, gamblers, and criminals gathered. It was here that Malcolm Little saw power displayed in a way he had never witnessed before: fast money, sharp suits, confidence, and fearlessness. Not long after, Malcolm Little moved to Harlem, New York, which in the 1940s was alive, dangerous, and unforgiving. Harlem was the cultural capital of Black America, but it was also saturated with poverty, drugs, gambling, and organized crime. This was where Malcolm Little earned the nickname that would define this chapter of his life. On the streets, he became known as Detroit Red. The name came from his reddish hair and his connection to Detroit through hustling networks. Detroit Red was flashy, sharp-tongued, fearless, and deeply involved in the underground economy. He dressed well, moved confidently, and lived fast. Detroit Red worked as a numbers runner, a drug dealer, a pimp, and a burglar. He carried weapons. He trusted no one completely. Violence was always nearby. This wasn't rebellion for the sake of rebellion. This was survival. Malcolm Little later explained that the streets offered something school never did: status. In a society that constantly told him he was nothing, the underground gave him identity and respect, even if it came with danger. But the lifestyle was unsustainable. In 1946, Detroit Red's luck ran out. Malcolm Little was arrested in Boston for burglary, along with his white girlfriend Sophia and an accomplice. The crimes involved breaking into wealthy homes and stealing jewelry, watches, and cash. The sentence was harsh. Malcolm Little was convicted and sentenced to 8 to 10 years in prison, despite first-time offenders often receiving lighter punishment. He would later note that race played a major role in the severity of his sentence. At just 20 years old, Malcolm Little was sent to prison. He entered Charlestown State Prison, angry, bitter, and hostile. Guards labeled him dangerous. Inmates avoided him. He cursed constantly, challenged authority, and rejected religion. Some inmates called him Satan because of his rage and refusal to submit. At this stage, Malcolm Little had no faith in America, no faith in religion, and no faith in people. But prison has a way of slowing time. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. Malcolm Little met a man known as John Elton Bembry, nicknamed Bimbi. Bimbi was intelligent, articulate, disciplined, and respected by both inmates and guards. He commanded attention not with violence but with knowledge. Bimbi could debate, quote history, and speak with authority. For Malcolm Little, this was a turning point. He realized something that would change his life forever. Real power came from knowledge. Soon after, Malcolm Little began receiving letters from his siblings, particularly his brother Filbert Little, introducing him to the teachings of the Nation of Islam and its leader, Elijah Muhammad. At first, Malcolm Little resisted, but slowly the ideas took hold. While imprisoned, Malcolm Little transferred to Norfolk Prison Colony, a facility known for encouraging education and rehabilitation. This move would redefine him. He began reading obsessively: history, philosophy, religion, sociology, politics. He copied the entire dictionary by hand, page by page, so he could master language. He read for hours every day, often late into the night. His vocabulary expanded. His thinking sharpened. His anger began to transform into focus. Malcolm Little would later say that prison was where he truly became educated. Not in classrooms, but in isolation. By the early 1950s, the man who entered prison as Detroit Red no longer existed. In his place was someone disciplined, articulate, and intellectually dangerous. In 1952, after serving about 6 years, Malcolm Little was released on parole. He walked out of prison physically free, but mentally reborn. The streets had taken years from him. Prison had given him a purpose. If you believe in second chances, like this part of the story. By the late 1940s, while still behind prison walls, Malcolm Little was no longer the reckless figure known on the streets as Detroit Red. Prison had slowed him down. Isolation forced him inward, and it was during this period, cut off from society, that the most important transformation of his life began. It started quietly. Letters. They came from his siblings, especially Filbert Little, Wilfred Little, and Hilda Little, who told Malcolm Little about a growing religious and political movement called the Nation of Islam. At the center of this movement was a man named Elijah Muhammad. At first, Malcolm Little dismissed it. He had already rejected Christianity, seeing it as a tool used to justify slavery and racial oppression. Religion, to him, had failed black people, but the letters kept coming, and the message was different from anything he had heard before. The Nation of Islam taught that black people were the original people of the world, that white supremacy was not natural, but manufactured, that black Americans were mentally enslaved long after physical slavery ended. This wasn't preached as symbolism. It was presented as truth. Malcolm Little was told that Christianity had been imposed on enslaved Africans to make them obedient, that their true history, names, and culture had been erased, that the suffering he had witnessed his entire life was not accidental, it was systemic. For the first time, Malcolm Little encountered a belief system that explained his pain instead of dismissing it. The teachings of Elijah Muhammad framed black suffering as a crime committed against a people, not a personal failure. That mattered. While incarcerated at Norfolk Prison Colony, Malcolm Little began studying the teachings more seriously. He stopped eating pork, stopped smoking, and stopped using drugs. He prayed. He disciplined himself. His anger did not disappear, it sharpened. Eventually, Malcolm Little wrote directly to Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad responded. That exchange sealed the transformation. Malcolm Little formally converted to the Nation of Islam while still in prison. One of the most symbolic acts came next. He rejected the surname Little. According to Nation of Islam teachings, surnames like Little, Smith, Johnson, or Williams were not African names. They were the names of slave owners. They represented a stolen identity, a history erased by force. Malcolm Little replaced his last name with a single letter, X. The X symbolized the unknown African name that had been lost through slavery. It was a declaration not of weakness, but of resistance. From that moment forward, Malcolm Little became Malcolm X. This was not rebranding. This was rebirth. By the time Malcolm X was released from prison in 1952, he was no longer searching for direction. He already had one. He traveled immediately to Chicago, where he met Elijah Muhammad in person for the first time. That meeting left a lasting impression. Malcolm X saw Elijah Muhammad as a teacher, a leader, and a father figure, something he had lost decades earlier with the death of Earl Little. Malcolm X devoted himself completely. There was no hesitation, no halfway commitment. He followed the Nation of Islam's strict code: discipline, self-control, moral reform, and absolute loyalty to Elijah Muhammad. He stopped drinking. He stopped gambling. He rejected the street life entirely. The Nation of Islam taught separation, not integration. They rejected the idea that black Americans should beg for acceptance into white society. Instead, they preached self-reliance, economic independence, and black unity. For Malcolm X, this was revolutionary. America had told him his whole life that his suffering was his fault. The Nation of Islam told him it was systemic. America had stripped him of identity. The Nation of Islam gave him one back. Malcolm X began studying intensely not just religion but history, politics, and rhetoric. He memorized scripture. He refined his speech. He sharpened his arguments. Soon, it became clear that Malcolm X wasn't just a follower. He was a force. Within months of his release, Malcolm X was traveling, organizing, and speaking. His discipline, intelligence, and intensity made him stand out immediately. Elijah Muhammad recognized this and began assigning Malcolm X increasing responsibility. The man who once couldn't see a future beyond survival now believed he had a mission. This chapter was not about redemption in the traditional sense. It was about awakening. Malcolm X believed he had discovered the truth about himself, his people, and America, and he was no longer willing to stay silent. The transformation that began in a prison cell was about to shake the nation. When Malcolm X returned to society in 1952, he did not ease his way back into the world. He charged into it. Fresh out of prison, Malcolm X immersed himself fully in the Nation of Islam, committing every hour of his life to the movement and to Elijah Muhammad, the man he viewed as his spiritual leader and guide. His discipline was extreme. His loyalty was absolute. His energy was relentless. Elijah Muhammad quickly noticed something different about Malcolm X. Most converts followed instructions. Malcolm X executed them. Within a short period, Malcolm X was appointed minister of Temple No. 11 in Boston. The Boston Temple had been small and struggling, but under Malcolm X's leadership, attendance increased rapidly. He spoke with clarity, force, and conviction. His speeches were not emotional pleas, they were indictments. He spoke directly to the anger, frustration, and humiliation black Americans carried every day. Word spread fast. Not long after, Malcolm X was transferred to Temple No. 7 in Harlem, New York, the most visible and strategically important location in the Nation of Islam. Harlem was the center of black political and cultural life. Whoever controlled Harlem controlled the narrative. Malcolm X transformed the Harlem Temple into a powerhouse. Membership exploded. Meetings filled beyond capacity. People stood outside just to hear his words through open doors. He spoke without notes, weaving history, religion, and lived experience into arguments that were impossible to ignore. Malcolm X did not ask for attention. He commanded it. By the mid-1950s, Malcolm X had become the public face of the Nation of Islam, even though Elijah Muhammad remained its undisputed leader. When the media wanted answers, they went to Malcolm X. When television networks wanted debates, they called Malcolm X. When newspapers wanted controversy, they printed Malcolm X's words. Recognizing the need to control their own narrative, the Nation of Islam launched an official newspaper in 1961. It was called Muhammad Speaks. Malcolm X played a major role in its creation and promotion. The paper spread the nation's teachings nationwide, addressing police brutality, racism, economic inequality, and black self-determination. It gave the movement a unified voice and bypassed mainstream media. Circulation grew into the hundreds of thousands. Through speeches, print, and public appearances, Malcolm X became unavoidable. Elijah Muhammad formally appointed Malcolm X as the national representative of the Nation of Islam. This role made Malcolm X responsible for organizing temples across the country, recruiting members, training ministers, and representing the nation at public events. He traveled constantly: Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Oakland, building structures, delivering speeches, and expanding influence. Under Malcolm X's leadership, the Nation of Islam grew from a small religious sect into a national movement, with tens of thousands of members. But Malcolm X's rise came with consequences. His intelligence, charisma, and media presence made him more famous than any other minister in the nation, and in many cases more visible than Elijah Muhammad himself. Cameras followed him. Reporters quoted him. Universities invited him. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Malcolm X was one of the most recognizable black leaders in America. He appeared in documentaries, debates, and interviews, including the widely viewed television program, The Hate That Hate, produced in 1959, which introduced millions of Americans to the Nation of Islam and to Malcolm X. Some saw him as dangerous. Others saw him as honest. No one ignored him. Malcolm X spoke openly against integration, criticizing civil rights leaders who preached nonviolence and patience. He rejected the idea that black people should appeal to the conscience of white America. He argued that freedom was never given, it was taken. His message was unapologetic, and it resonated deeply with young black Americans who were tired of waiting. By this point, Malcolm X was no longer just a minister. He was a symbol of defiance, a symbol of black self-respect, a symbol of resistance in a country that demanded obedience. But power attracts pressure, and as Malcolm X rose higher within the Nation of Islam, unseen fractures were already forming beneath the surface, fractures that would soon change everything. Comment growth if you want more history like this. By the early 1960s, Malcolm X was no longer just a minister within the Nation of Islam. He was a national figure. His words were being quoted, criticized, feared, and repeated across America. Newspapers printed his statements. Television cameras followed him. College campuses debated him, and law enforcement agencies monitored him closely. Malcolm X had become impossible to ignore. At the center of his public philosophy was a sharp and controversial rejection of the dominant civil rights strategy of the time, nonviolence. Malcolm X openly criticized mainstream civil rights leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., not as a personal attack, but as a fundamental disagreement over survival and dignity. Dr. King preached nonviolence, integration, and appealing to America's moral conscience. Malcolm X saw something else. He saw black communities being beaten, attacked by police dogs, sprayed with fire hoses, lynched, and jailed, while being told to remain patient. To Malcolm X, patience had become another word for submission. He argued that nonviolence only worked when the oppressor had a conscience, and history had shown him otherwise. Malcolm X famously stated that black people had the right to defend themselves by any means necessary. This phrase was not a call to random violence. It was a declaration of self-defense. Malcolm X made a clear distinction. He did not advocate initiating violence, but he rejected the idea that black people should accept violence without resistance. If the law failed to protect black lives, he argued, then black people had the right to protect themselves. This position shocked white America. But to many black Americans, it sounded like truth. Malcolm X's speeches were precise, confrontational, and rooted in history. He cited slavery, Jim Crow laws, police brutality, and economic exploitation as evidence that America had never intended to deliver justice voluntarily. He described racism not as a moral flaw, but as a system, carefully constructed and violently enforced. Unlike other leaders, Malcolm X did not soften his language for white audiences. He spoke unapologetically, and that unapologetic tone turned him into a household name. By 1962, Malcolm X was appearing regularly in national media. He debated politicians, journalists, and academics. He was interviewed by major newspapers and television networks. His speeches were recorded, distributed, and replayed across the country. Universities invited him to speak, sometimes reluctantly, knowing his presence would draw massive crowds. Students packed lecture halls. Some came to challenge him. Others came to listen. Many left changed. Malcolm X had a rare ability. He could make people uncomfortable while forcing them to think. He spoke quickly, clearly, and without hesitation. He did not rely on emotional manipulation. He relied on logic, history, and lived experience. His public persona was disciplined and controlled, always sharply dressed, always alert, always prepared. Behind the scenes, government agencies took notice. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and local police departments closely monitored Malcolm X, tracking his speeches and movements. Files were opened. Surveillance intensified. His influence was seen as a potential threat to public order. But Malcolm X did not slow down. He continued to sharpen his message. He argued that the civil rights struggle was not just about integration, it was about human rights. And human rights, he believed, should be taken to the global stage, exposing America before the world. Malcolm X believed Black Americans should stop asking for acceptance and start demanding justice. His words cut deep because they named realities many lived but rarely heard spoken aloud. Some of Malcolm X's most quoted statements from this period captured his philosophy clearly. You can't separate peace from freedom because no one can be at peace unless he has his freedom. If you're not ready to die for it, put the word freedom out of your vocabulary. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. These words traveled far beyond the nation of Islam. They entered living rooms, classrooms, and street conversations. By the early 1960s, Malcolm X represented a growing divide within the Black freedom struggle, between those who believed America could be reformed and those who believed it had to be confronted. He was admired by some, feared by others, and hated by many. But one thing was certain: Malcolm X had changed the conversation. The movement was no longer speaking with one voice, and Malcolm X's voice was among the loudest. And as his influence grew, so did tensions, not just with white America, but within the nation of Islam itself. Which Malcolm X quote resonates with you the most? Drop it in the comments below. By late 1963, the rise of Malcolm X had reached a dangerous height. He was still the most visible spokesman of the Nation of Islam, still the minister of Temple No. 7 in Harlem, still the man reporters called when they wanted answers. But beneath the surface, the relationship between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad was deteriorating. Quietly at first, then publicly. The breaking point began with an event that shook the entire nation. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. America went into mourning. Flags were lowered. Television coverage was nonstop. Political leaders urged unity and restraint. Malcolm X was asked to comment. His response would change everything. Malcolm X stated that the assassination was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. He explained that a violent society inevitably produces violent outcomes, and that America's history of brutality, both abroad and at home, had finally turned inward. He did not celebrate Kennedy's death, but he refused to mourn it. The statement exploded across the media. Headlines condemned him. Politicians demanded consequences. The Nation of Islam suddenly found itself under even heavier scrutiny. Behind the scenes, Elijah Muhammad was furious. Elijah Muhammad had already instructed Nation of Islam ministers not to comment on the assassination at all. Malcolm X had ignored that directive, and done so publicly. Within days, Malcolm X was silenced. Elijah Muhammad announced that Malcolm X was suspended for 90 days from public speaking and representing the Nation of Islam. Officially, it was punishment for the JFK remarks. But the truth ran deeper. Long before the suspension, Malcolm X had begun uncovering information that shook his loyalty to its core. While traveling and organizing for the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X learned of allegations involving Elijah Muhammad's personal misconduct, specifically, relationships with young women who were secretaries within the organization, resulting in children. These revelations directly contradicted the Nation of Islam's strict moral code, which emphasized discipline, sexual restraint, and moral purity. For Malcolm X, this was devastating. Elijah Muhammad was not just a leader. He was a symbol. The man who had guided Malcolm X out of prison, given his life direction, and reshaped his identity. Now that image was cracking. Malcolm X struggled internally. He did not immediately go public. He attempted to reconcile what he had learned with his faith and loyalty. But the more he investigated, the clearer it became that the allegations were true. This was not rumor. It was reality. And it left Malcolm X feeling betrayed. At the same time, jealousy and resentment toward Malcolm X were growing within the Nation of Islam's leadership. His fame had eclipsed others. His speeches drew more attention than Elijah Muhammad's. Some ministers viewed him as a threat. The suspension isolated Malcolm X. He was barred from speaking publicly. His platform disappeared overnight. Followers were warned to keep their distance. Death threats increased. Even more alarming, Malcolm X later revealed that he was told the Nation of Islam would be better off if he were dead. The movement he had helped build was now turning against him. The 90-day suspension quietly became permanent. There was no reconciliation. No return to power. Malcolm X realized that the organization he had devoted his life to was no longer a place where he could speak freely or honestly. By early 1964, the break was inevitable. In March 1964, Malcolm X publicly announced his departure from the Nation of Islam. He stated clearly that he still respected Elijah Muhammad as a religious teacher, but could no longer remain silent in the face of hypocrisy, corruption, and internal betrayal. The fallout was immediate. Former allies became enemies, protection vanished, threats multiplied, surveillance intensified. Malcolm X had lost the institutional shield of the Nation of Islam, but he had gained something else. Independence. For the first time since prison, Malcolm X was no longer speaking for anyone but himself. And that made him more dangerous than ever. If controversies shaped history, like this video. By 1964, the break was no longer rumor. It was real. After years as the most visible voice of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X officially severed ties with the organization that had shaped his second life. In March 1964, he announced publicly that he had left the Nation of Islam and was moving forward independently. This was not a quiet exit. It was dangerous. Malcolm X was walking away from a powerful organization, one that had given him protection, structure, and a following. and he was doing it while under surveillance, under threat, and under constant media attention. But Malcolm X made it clear he could no longer remain silent or constrained. Shortly after his departure, Malcolm X founded a new religious organization called Muslim Mosque, Inc. Unlike the Nation of Islam, Muslim Mosque, Inc. was grounded in Orthodox Islam, not the unique theology taught by Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm X emphasized traditional Islamic beliefs, discipline, prayer, and moral reform, but without racial absolutism. This shift was significant. For years, Malcolm X had preached racial separation as the only solution to black oppression in America. Now, his thinking was evolving. He was no longer speaking only to black Americans within the Nation of Islam. He was speaking to the world. Malcolm X made it clear that Muslim Mosque, Inc. was not just a religious institution. It was also a platform for political awareness, education, and international engagement. He began addressing broader audiences: civil rights activists, students, journalists, international leaders, people he previously would not have engaged with while bound by Nation of Islam doctrine. His tone began to change. Not softer, more precise. Malcolm X no longer framed the struggle solely as black versus white. Instead, he began describing it as oppressed versus oppressor, colonized versus colonizer, human rights denied by power. He openly stated that he was re-examining his earlier views. This honesty shocked both critics and supporters. Some accused him of abandoning his principles. Others saw growth. Malcolm X himself acknowledged that he was learning in real time, unlearning rigid thinking shaped by anger, and replacing it with broader understanding shaped by experience. During this period, Malcolm X traveled extensively, speaking across the United States and abroad. He met with civil rights leaders he once dismissed. He attended forums, debates, and conferences. He spoke at universities and community centers, often without security. But the risks were growing. The split from the Nation of Islam left Malcolm X exposed. He no longer had organizational protection. His former allies were now hostile. Threats became constant. Law enforcement surveillance intensified. Despite this, Malcolm X refused to retreat. He believed that truth required evolution, and that clinging to outdated beliefs was another form of captivity. Malcolm X was no longer a spokesperson for a single movement. He was becoming something else entirely. A global voice. A bridge between Black American struggle and international human rights. A man redefining himself in public, knowing full well that reinvention came with a price. The break with the Nation of Islam was not the end of Malcolm X's journey. It was the beginning of his most dangerous transformation. Because the more Malcolm X widened his vision, the more enemies he gained, and the closer he moved toward a fate that history would never forget. In April 1964, only weeks after breaking with the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X left the United States on a journey that would permanently alter his worldview and redefine his identity. This was not a publicity tour. This was a pilgrimage. Malcolm X traveled to Mecca, Saudi Arabia, to perform the Hajj, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. For Malcolm X, this journey was both spiritual and personal. He was searching for clarity after years of ideological rigidity, internal conflict, and public confrontation. What he encountered in Mecca challenged everything he thought he knew about race. Upon arrival, Malcolm X was immersed in a sea of humanity unlike anything he had ever experienced. Muslims from every corner of the world, Africa, Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, gathered together, dressed in identical white garments, praying side by side. There were black Muslims. There were white Muslims. There were Muslims with blonde hair and blue eyes. And they were all equal. Malcolm X later wrote that he had never witnessed such genuine brotherhood across racial lines. In Mecca, no one was treated as superior or inferior based on skin color. Status dissolved. Race dissolved. What remained was shared faith and shared humanity. This experience shook him. For years, Malcolm X had preached that white people were inherently incapable of justice. In Mecca, he encountered white Muslims who treated him not as an enemy, but as a brother. This did not erase his understanding of racism in America, but it expanded it. Malcolm X realized that racism was not a permanent condition of humanity. It was a political and social disease, not a biological truth. From Mecca, Malcolm X wrote letters back to the United States describing his transformation. In these letters, he acknowledged that some of his previous conclusions had been too narrow. He emphasized that Islam, practiced correctly, could unite people across racial boundaries. This was not weakness. It was evolution. During the Hajj, Malcolm X formally embraced Orthodox Sunni Islam, separating himself completely from the teachings of the Nation of Islam. As part of this spiritual rebirth, he adopted a new name, el-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz. El-Hajj signified that he had completed the pilgrimage to Mecca. Malik meant king. El-Shabazz referenced what he believed to be his ancestral lineage. This name represented a complete transformation, religious, intellectual, and personal. Malcolm X was no longer just rejecting oppression. He was redefining identity. After Mecca, el-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz traveled across Africa and the Middle East, meeting with political leaders, scholars, and activists. He visited countries including Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, Algeria, and Saudi Arabia, engaging with revolutionary thinkers and heads of state. These meetings further reshaped his understanding of global oppression. He began to frame the struggle of Black Americans as part of a larger international fight against colonialism and exploitation. The civil rights struggle, he now believed, was not just an American issue. It was a human rights issue. When el-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz returned to the United States, people noticed the change immediately. His tone was calmer, his language more inclusive, his focus broader. But his commitment to justice remained unshaken. He did not abandon his criticism of racism. He refined it. He did not retreat from confrontation. He elevated it. This transformation made Malcolm X more dangerous than ever, not because he was angrier, but because he was wiser. He could now speak to multiple audiences. He could challenge America not just morally, but internationally. And that made him a threat to more than just domestic power structures. This journey marked the final evolution of Malcolm X, from prisoner to preacher to revolutionary thinker with a global vision. If your worldview ever changed, comment transform below. When Malcolm X returned to the United States after his pilgrimage to Mecca and travels across Africa and the Middle East, he was no longer operating from the same framework that had defined his earlier years. He had changed, and now he needed a new structure that reflected that change. In June 1964, Malcolm X founded a secular political organization called the Organization of Afro-American Unity, commonly known as the OAAU. The name was intentional. The OAAU was modeled after the Organization of African Unity, OAU, a coalition of newly independent African nations formed in 1963 to resist colonialism and promote solidarity across the African continent. Malcolm X believed Black Americans were part of the same global struggle, descendants of Africa living under a different form of domination. The Organization of Afro-American Unity was not religious. It was political, and its mission was clear. The OAAU aimed to unite Black Americans across religious, ideological, and class lines, Christians, Muslims, nationalists, integrationists, anyone committed to dignity, justice, and self-determination. This was a major shift. For years, Malcolm X had supported separatism through the Nation of Islam. Now, he was calling for unity not based on theology, but on human rights. The OAAU focused on voter education, economic empowerment, police accountability, and international advocacy. Malcolm X argued that civil rights framed the struggle too narrowly within U.S. law. Human rights, he believed, exposed America to global scrutiny. He wanted to bring the United States before the United Nations, accusing it of violating the human rights of Black Americans. This was a bold and dangerous idea. It meant internationalizing America's racial problem, something the U.S. government desperately wanted to avoid during the Cold War. Malcolm X knew exactly what he was doing. As part of this strategy, Malcolm X intensified his international travel. He met with African heads of state, diplomats, and revolutionary leaders, building alliances and seeking support for the OAAU's mission. He spoke with leaders in Ghana, Egypt, Algeria, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. He attended meetings with representatives of newly independent nations who understood colonial violence firsthand. In these conversations, Malcolm X presented Black Americans not as a minority group seeking favors, but as a colonized people seeking justice. Many listened. Some supported him openly, others quietly. This international engagement made Malcolm X more influential and more threatening than ever before. He was no longer just challenging American racism domestically. He was challenging America's image on the world stage. At home, the OAAU held meetings, forums, and educational programs. Malcolm X spoke to young activists, community leaders, and students, encouraging political awareness and global thinking. He emphasized discipline, unity, and self-respect. But the organization faced challenges. Malcolm X was under constant surveillance. Funding was limited, and the threats against his life intensified. The split from the Nation of Islam had left deep scars, and hostility followed him everywhere. Still, Malcolm X pressed forward. He believed time was short. He often said he was living on borrowed time, and he acted like it. The OAAU represented Malcolm X's final vision, a movement rooted in truth, connected globally, and unafraid to confront power directly. It was the clearest expression of his growth. From separatism to solidarity. From religion to human rights. From national struggle to global resistance. But as Malcolm X expanded his reach, the danger around him closed in. Enemies were no longer limited to ideology. They were personal. And the next chapter would reveal just how close the threat had come. After breaking with the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X entered the most dangerous period of his life. The protection he once had was gone. What replaced it was fear, isolation, and constant threat. From the moment Malcolm X announced his departure in 1964, the tone around him changed. Former allies turned hostile. Anonymous warnings began arriving. Friends urged caution. Some warned him directly that his life was in danger. Malcolm X did not exaggerate the situation. He acknowledged it openly. He stated publicly that the Nation of Islam considered him a traitor. He revealed that people close to him had informed him that his death was being discussed. Surveillance followed him everywhere by law enforcement, by former associates, and by unknown figures whose intentions were impossible to read. Despite this, Malcolm X refused to stop speaking. He continued traveling. He continued organizing through the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He continued criticizing hypocrisy, racism, and betrayal, knowing full well that each word increased the danger. By late 1964, The threats became more specific. Phone calls, letters, warnings from supporters inside the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X told associates that he believed an assassination attempt was inevitable. He said plainly that he expected to die violently. And still he did not hide. Then, on the night of February 14, 1965, the threat became real. Just days before he was scheduled to speak at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City, Malcolm X's home in East Elmhurst, Queens, was attacked. At approximately 2:30 a.m., firebombs were thrown into the house where Malcolm X lived with his wife, el-Shabazz, and their children. The house erupted in flames. Inside were el-Shabazz and their daughters. Miraculously, they escaped without serious injury. The house was heavily damaged. The message was unmistakable. This was not intimidation anymore. This was an attempt to kill him and his family. Malcolm X arrived at the scene shortly after. Standing outside the burned home, he spoke to reporters. He did not accuse blindly. He did not dramatize. He simply stated that the attack was the result of the hostility surrounding his split from the Nation of Islam. Despite the severity of the attack, no one was arrested. No suspects were charged. No meaningful protection was provided. In the days following the firebombing, Malcolm X's friends and supporters begged him to cancel upcoming appearances. They urged him to leave the city. They warned that the next attempt would not miss. Malcolm X refused. He said he would not be silenced by fear. He said if he stopped speaking, the attackers would have already won. He moved his family temporarily but continued his schedule. He prepared for his speech at the Audubon Ballroom, scheduled for February 21, 1965. Behind the scenes, the pressure was crushing. Malcolm X was exhausted. He was sick. He was under-resourced. His security was minimal. Many former Nation of Islam members who once protected him were no longer present. Still, he pressed forward. He believed his message mattered more than his safety. He believed the truth required sacrifice. In private conversations, Malcolm X told associates that he did not expect to live long. He spoke calmly about death, not with fear, but with acceptance. He said that every revolutionary before him had paid a price. The firebombing was not the end of the danger. It was the final warning. The clock was running out. Short pause, hit like if you're still with us. The morning of February 21, 1965, began like any other for Malcolm X. He had prepared a speech for members of his Organization of Afro-American Unity and supporters of human rights. The venue, the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan, New York City, a space known for hosting political and cultural events. Malcolm X arrived early. Security was minimal. Only a few close associates were present to accompany him. There was tension in the air, a tension he had become accustomed to in the months following his split from the Nation of Islam and the firebombing of his Queens home. At approximately 3:10 p.m., as he began addressing the crowd, the danger turned deadly. Multiple assailants rushed the stage. They were armed with handguns and shotguns. Chaos erupted immediately. Malcolm X tried to defend himself, but he was overwhelmed. He was struck multiple times. Bullets tore through his body in front of witnesses, in front of children, in front of the very audience he had dedicated his life to empowering. He fell, the room erupted in panic, people scrambled, screams filled the air, ambulances were called, but the wounds were fatal. Malcolm X, the man who had survived poverty, crime, imprisonment, ideological battles, and threats to his life, died at 39 years old. Three men: Talmadge Hayer, also known as Thomas Hagen, Norman 3X Butler, later Mohammed Abdul Aziz, and Thomas 15X Johnson, later Khalil Islam. All members of the Nation of Islam were arrested and convicted for the assassination. Hayer admitted to his role, but Butler and Johnson maintained their innocence. For decades, the case remained controversial. Questions about whether others were involved, potentially with links to law enforcement or government agencies, lingered. Investigations were reopened multiple times. In 2021, after extensive review, the convictions of Mohammed Abdul Aziz and Khalil Islam were formally overturned, decades after their imprisonment. New evidence suggested law enforcement failed to properly investigate the assassination and may have ignored or concealed key details. Malcolm X's death sent shockwaves across the United States and the world. His assassination did not silence his message. Instead, it immortalized him. Newspapers, activists, scholars, and ordinary people debated his ideas, his vision, and the circumstances surrounding his death. His life had been defined by transformation. From Malcolm Little, the boy shaped by poverty and violence, to Detroit Red, the streetwise hustler, to Malcolm X, the fiery minister, and finally el-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, the global human rights advocate. Each phase had been dramatic, dangerous, and revolutionary. And in death, Malcolm X became a symbol of resistance, courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth. His assassination underscored the very dangers he had warned about, the cost of speaking honestly in a society built on inequality, prejudice, and fear. Comment justice if you want truth and transparency in history. The story of Malcolm X did not end with his assassination. In fact, it was only beginning. In 1965, shortly after his death, the autobiography of Malcolm X, co-written with Alex Haley, was published. The book offered an unflinching account of his life, from Malcolm Little, the boy shaped by violence and loss, to Detroit Red, the street hustler, to Malcolm X, the minister and revolutionary, and finally to el-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, the global human rights advocate. The autobiography resonated deeply. Readers were captivated by Malcolm X's honesty, intelligence, and relentless pursuit of truth. It became an instant bestseller and has remained a staple in libraries, classrooms, and activist circles for decades. His words continue to inspire anyone seeking justice, empowerment, and transformation. Malcolm X's influence extended far beyond books. His speeches, interviews, and ideas fueled the Black Power movement in the 1960s and 1970s. Leaders like Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, Angela Davis, and countless others drew from his philosophy of self-determination, discipline, and unapologetic resistance. Globally, Malcolm X became a symbol for oppressed peoples everywhere. His critique of systemic injustice, his insistence on human rights, and his belief in international solidarity resonated with activists fighting colonialism, apartheid, and racial inequality across the world. His legacy has been preserved in countless ways. Films like Spike Lee's Malcolm X, 1992, brought his life and message to new generations. Documentaries, biographies, and scholarly works continue to examine his impact. Murals across cities in the United States and Africa celebrate his image, reminding communities of his life and struggle. In New York City, the Shabazz Center, named after his family, stands as a tribute to his life, work, and enduring influence. Schools, libraries, and community centers honor his contributions, ensuring that his story continues to educate and inspire. Malcolm X's life demonstrates that transformation is possible at any stage. From poverty and crime to spiritual awakening and global advocacy, he embodies resilience, courage, and the power of self-reinvention. His message of justice, equality, and human rights transcends time and remains relevant today. Even decades after his death, Malcolm X remains a symbol of resistance, empowerment, and transformation. He challenges each generation to confront oppression, speak truth to power, and demand justice. If this story moved you, like, comment, and hit subscribe, and share tales of the real with someone who loves real history.